The silence between them was never empty. The night was velvet black outside the studio walls, but inside Studio 7 at Paramount, the lights were warm and golden, soft enough to make everyone look like they were glowing, but focused enough to catch every flicker of emotion. The world had been waiting for this episode, but no one, not even the producers, knew what was about to happen when Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock sat across from each other for the first time in years. Keanu hadn't aged the way most people did. He had quietly weathered storms in private, each wrinkle etched with grief, each pause in his voice holding the weight of unspoken truths. Sandra, radiant in a white silk blouse and black slacks, wore her signature smile like armor. But behind that grace was a history too long hidden behind the cameras. Between them was a story, unlabeled, unspoken, unfinished. The crowd clapped as the segment began. It wasn't just a reunion. It was a live tribute episode, a celebration of their careers. But the audience didn't know this night was also going to become something else, something real. "Welcome to our very special night," the host smiled, glancing between his guests. 25 years since Speed, 20 years since Lake House, decades of friendship, loyalty, silence, and rumors. Tonight we go deeper. Keanu shifted slightly, his fingers curled inward in his lap. Sandra looked down at her lap for a moment, then smiled as if pulling strength from the floor. The screen behind them lit up with footage, clips of red carpets, behind-the-scenes laughter, Sandra placing her head on Keanu's shoulder in between takes, Keanu giving a quiet smile as she cracked a joke. The chemistry was undeniable. Everyone knew. Everyone had always known. And yet, no headlines had ever confirmed what millions suspected. Why? Because some truths stay sacred. The segment rolled, showing a younger Sandra wiping something off Keanu's face on set. "He had ketchup on his cheek," she said then. "Of course I wiped it. What are friends for?" The audience laughed. Now in present time, the clip faded to black. But the silence afterward hung heavy. "Sandra," the host leaned in gently, "do you think the world ever misunderstood what was between you and Keanu?" Her eyes softened. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "I think people often look at what's beautiful and try to label it. But some things are too big for labels. They just are." Keanu looked at her, and for the first time all night, his eyes didn't drop. He held her gaze. The audience went quiet. He leaned toward his mic. "I think it's time I say something I never have." The host blinked, now. Keanu nodded. Sandra turned toward him fully. Her body stiffened ever so slightly. And Keanu, the man who had lived through grief, who had once lost his unborn child, his fiancée, and years of peace, now took a breath and looked at the one person he had never allowed himself to lose. "Years ago," Keanu said quietly, "we were filming Lake House. It was a strange movie, letters through time, people who never met yet fell in love through ink and paper. Fiction, they said, but it didn't feel like fiction to me." Sandra didn't move. He continued, slower now. "Every day we weren't filming, I'd walk home thinking about what I didn't say, about moments we shared. I was falling in a way I didn't have the right to." The audience collectively inhaled. The host froze. The camera crew stopped moving. And Sandra. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "I stayed silent," Keanu said, his voice hoarse. "Because your happiness mattered more than my truth. You were with someone, and later I wasn't whole enough to be with anyone." A tear fell silently down Sandra's cheek. She didn't wipe it. Keanu finally turned to her. "You were the light in so many of my darkest seasons, and you didn't even know. When I lost Jennifer and the baby, I remember one day you sent me flowers. No note, just light, and that's who you've always been." Her chin trembled. "That's who you still are." She tried to speak, "Keanu, but her voice broke. The host gently motioned for the cameras to fade to commercial, but Keanu shook his head. "No," he said quietly, "let them see this. The world sees enough fake things, let them see this." Sandra leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "You should have told me." "I didn't think I deserved you," Keanu said. And with that, the tears broke free. From her eyes. From his. From the audience. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about romance in a traditional sense. It was about something deeper, a shared history of quiet respect, love held back, timing never quite right, and moments passed without being seized. And now, Now they sat in silence that didn't need filling. The crowd clapped slowly, then louder. Not for the acting, not for the fame, but for the raw, naked courage of truth spoken at last. And for two people who carried love with reverence, even when unspoken. The world watched, but all he saw was her. The world outside buzzed with noise, news articles, trending hashtags, reaction clips flooding the internet like a storm that refused to die down. But inside their separate hotel rooms that night, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock didn't care about any of it. The air was heavier than ever, full of words still unsaid. His revelation on live television had shaken something deeper, not only in her but in him too. For years, they had danced around a flame without daring to reach out and feel its warmth. Out of fear, out of timing, out of loyalty. But now the fire was exposed, and both were unsure whether it would heal or burn. Keanu sat by the window of his suite, the city sprawling beneath him like a living mural. In one hand was a glass of untouched wine, in the other an old letter he had once written to Sandra and never sent. Folded neatly, the paper had worn at the corners from years of moving with him, from trailers to apartments, from sets to silent hotel nights where he almost mailed it, but never could. The words had aged just like they had. He read them again, and again. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of them. He wasn't the same man who had hidden behind loyalty to her happiness. He wasn't the man who believed his grief made him unworthy of love. Meanwhile, across the city, Sandra stood barefoot in her hotel room, her hands pressed against the cold glass of the window. The lights of the city blurred through her tears. Her phone had been ringing non-stop. Agents, producers, talk shows, even opera's team. Everyone wanted a follow-up. Everyone wanted the next moment. But they didn't understand. This wasn't a performance. This was her real life, and for the first time in years, the past had broken free from its perfect little box. She whispered his name without realizing, Keanu. They had been everything to each other, except what they really wanted to be. Back in the studio earlier, the producers had asked her if she was okay to continue the interview. She had nodded, but when the cameras turned back on, there was no script left to follow. No segment cards, just silence and Keanu. She had turned to him. I thought I was the only one who felt all of that. He had looked at her, eyes red. You were. In her room now, Sandra paced. Her heart wasn't just aching, it was trembling, not with regret, but with realization that maybe she hadn't just been part of his light. Maybe he had been the one keeping hers alive, too, all those years. Every birthday call from him that made her feel safe. Every small message after her divorce when no one else checked in. Every little kindness that felt invisible to the world but enormous to her. They had both survived so much, but not alone. She picked up her phone, opened a new message, then deleted it, then typed again. Finally, she pressed send. Can we meet, just us? No cameras, no crowd, just truth. Keanu's phone buzzed softly. He looked down, and for a long time he just stared at her message. Then he stood up, set the letter down on the nightstand, and reached for his coat. 1 hour later, they met at a small cafe tucked into the quiet side of Laurel Canyon. It was the kind of place you only knew about if you lived in LA long enough to crave peace more than luxury. It was empty that late at night. A single server stood behind the counter, clearly shocked at who had just walked in. Keanu ordered tea. Sandra asked for black coffee. They sat across from each other, no table between them, just silence. You meant everything you said, she whispered. I did. And you held it in for how long? He sighed, voice low. Since 1994. She blinked, that long. He nodded, almost embarrassed. After Speed, I was sure you'd end up with someone like that director you dated. Someone larger than life. I didn't think I could fit. Sandra laughed gently, but it broke. You always fit. I just didn't know I was allowed to want you. Her words hit him harder than anything he'd faced on camera. You were always allowed, he said. And then came the silence that didn't suffocate. It soothed. For an hour they talked not about movies or fame or fans, but about their parents, their pasts, the people they lost and the moments they ran from. He told her how lonely some red carpets felt. She told him how her adoption journey almost broke her until he sent her a letter with just 2 words. You're enough. He had forgotten he'd sent it, but she never did. Time didn't feel linear in that cafe. It felt sacred, as if the world had paused to give them a second chance, not as lovers under pressure, but as 2 people who finally gave themselves permission to be honest. And just as they were about to leave, Sandra did something she hadn't done in years. She reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't want to wait anymore," she said. Keanu didn't pull back. "You don't have to." And that was all it took. Not declarations, not dramatic kisses, just hands meeting across time. Because sometimes that's how love returns, not with noise, but with stillness that finally feels safe. The letter she never knew existed. The next morning unfolded with a strange softness, one of those rare Los Angeles dawns where the sky holds a golden stillness, and time itself feels suspended. Sandra Bullock awoke to the filtered glow of sunrise slipping through sheer curtains, her eyes opening slowly, not to the world's noise, but to the quiet echo of a conversation that had shifted everything. The night at the cafe lingered like a tender dream that hadn't yet let go. She didn't need to replay it to remember every word. Her fingers still remembered the feel of his hand, strong, steady, uncertain, but finally reaching back. That touch had said what years of silence never could, that they were done running. That time had taken so much, but not this. Meanwhile, Keanu sat in his hotel room, barely breathing as he stared at the worn letter that had traveled with him for over 2 decades. The edges were bent, the ink slightly faded, but the heart of it still pulsed, untouched, unsent. It was a letter he had written in 2006 during the filming of The Lake House. At the time, he had been drowning in grief, healing in fragments, and holding on to a kind of love that terrified him, not because it was loud, but because it was quiet, constant. He had written it after a day of filming a scene where their characters talked through time. That night, he realized they weren't just acting. He had been talking to her through time, too, always too late, always too far. He picked it up now, unfolding the fragile paper with both reverence and regret. He had never meant for it to stay hidden this long. And now, after everything, after her message, her voice, her hand in his, he knew he couldn't keep this locked away anymore. That afternoon, he stood outside her gated home in Beverly Hills, holding the letter like a fragile truth. He didn't ring the bell, he didn't text her. He simply left the envelope at her doorstep with her name written in his unmistakable handwriting. No signature, no explanation, just a gesture that said, "This has always belonged to you." Sandra found it an hour later. The moment her eyes landed on the handwriting, her breath caught. She recognized it instantly. She pressed the envelope to her chest before she even opened it, as if preparing her heart for something sacred. Then, in the silence of her living room, she unfolded it slowly and began to read. "Sandra, I don't know when you'll read this, maybe never, but I need to write it anyway, because words unsaid feel heavier than grief sometimes. Today, we filmed a scene where I talked to you through time. But I think I've been doing that for years. I just never had the courage to let the message reach you. You are light, not the kind that blinds, the kind that finds people in dark places and helps them remember how to breathe. I've loved you quietly, respectfully, completely. And I know I have no right to say that. I know you're happy. I know I've always come too late. But if another life exists where timing is kinder, where pain didn't steal so much from me, and where I could have walked beside you instead of behind you, I'd take that life in a heartbeat. Until then, I'll just be proud to have witnessed your existence. Yours, even if never yours." "Kay." By the time she finished reading, her face was soaked with tears she didn't even realize had fallen. She didn't cry because it was romantic. She cried because it was real, because everything she had suspected but couldn't name had been true. Every quiet glance, every protective gesture, every time he stayed just close enough to catch her but far enough not to disrupt her world. It all made sense now. He hadn't loved her like a man chasing something. He had loved her like a man protecting something sacred. That night she showed up at his door. No cameras. No press. No makeup. Just Sandra, bare-faced, red-eyed, and holding the letter. He opened the door before she could knock. Their eyes met, and for a long moment they didn't speak. Then she held up the letter, voice trembling. "You should have sent this." "I was afraid," he replied. "Of what?" "That it would change everything." She stepped forward. "It already has." He didn't move, but she did. She reached for his hand, and for the second time in 2 days their fingers intertwined. But this time it wasn't hesitant. It was certain. "Keanu," she whispered, the letter still in her other hand, "I don't want to wonder anymore." He looked into her eyes. "Then don't." And just like that, something unspoken finally collapsed between them. Not with drama, not with fanfare, but like an old wall gently crumbling to reveal a view that had always been there, just waiting. They sat on the balcony that night, side by side, watching the city breathe below them. No headlines, no scripts, just two souls who had finally stopped waiting on time to give them permission. And in that silence, a new beginning whispered through the warm wind. Her children always knew his name. Weeks passed quietly, but the world hadn't stopped whispering. Headlines came and went like ocean waves. Keanu and Sandra, finally. The truth behind the tears, 2 decades of silence broken in one night. But beneath the noise, far away from the swirl of press and curious fans, something deeper was unfolding, slower, gentler, and far more real than any media story could capture. It was not a romance born of publicity or nostalgia. It was a homecoming of two souls that had long circled each other in orbit, finally deciding to land. Sandra had always been fiercely protective of her children. Louis and Layla weren't props in her life. They were the very center of it. The media only got fragments, but behind the walls of her quiet, warm home was a woman who had built her life around bedtime stories, school runs, and soft-spoken wisdom. And it was in that sanctuary that she made one of the most personal decisions of her life. She invited Keanu in, not just into her space, but into the world her children knew. Not as a movie star, not as the man from Speed, but as someone who had carried a part of her heart long before they were ever born. Keanu was nervous the day he came over. He had faced stunt explosions, tragic scripts, and the unforgiving silence of grief, but none of that compared to the weight he felt in his chest as he approached Sandra's front door. He wasn't nervous about being judged. He was nervous about deserving it. The family, the warmth, her trust, all of it. Because in all his years of wandering, he had never once felt like he truly belonged somewhere, but today he hoped to earn it not with charm, but with truth. The door opened before he could knock, and there stood Louis, Sandra's eldest, bright eyes, calm presence, a quiet strength that reminded Keanu of someone, himself maybe, or someone he wished he had been at that age. "You're Keanu," Louis said simply. Keanu nodded, "Yes." "I know," Louis smiled. "Mom talks about you." Before Keanu could respond, Layla peeked from behind her big brother, her eyes wide with curiosity. She didn't speak right away. She just looked up at him, as if trying to measure his soul in the space between silence and presence. Then she walked up and hugged him without warning. He froze. Then slowly, arms trembling, he hugged her back. Sandra watched from the hallway, her hand to her mouth, her eyes wet with something that was quite sadness and wasn't quite joy, but something sacred between the two. They spent the day together like a family that had always known each other. Keanu wasn't trying to impress the children. He wasn't performing. He listened. He played. He watched Layla's ballet twirls in the living room and helped Louis with a model spaceship he was building. He even stayed for dinner, sitting in Sandra's kitchen where laughter echoed off the walls and time seemed to pause in reverence. And when Layla fell asleep in Sandra's arms, Keanu gently took Louis's empty plate and helped wash the dishes. No cameras, no staff. Just him, his sleeves rolled up, quiet and present. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Sandra and Keanu sat in the garden. The moon was a silver coin in the sky, and the air held the scent of jasmine and grilled vegetables from dinner. They didn't speak for a long while. Then she turned to him. "You were scared today, weren't you?" He nodded, his voice almost a whisper, terrified. "But you stayed." He looked at her. "Because they're part of you, and I want to know all of you." She took a long breath. "They already like you, you know." "I like them too," he said. "A lot." Sandra reached for his hand. "They've known about you since they were old enough to ask about love. I told them once there was someone who never left my heart, even when he wasn't around." Keanu's grip tightened around her fingers. "You told them that?" "I did," she said, her voice thick. "Because I didn't want them to think love only lives in houses. Sometimes it lives in memories, in letters, in long silences, but sometimes, if we're lucky, it comes back." Keanu looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Or maybe, finally allowing himself to believe that she was really there, that she wasn't going to vanish when the credits rolled, that this wasn't another dream. He leaned in then, not with urgency, but with reverence. And for the first time in decades, they kissed. It wasn't a kiss born of youthful adrenaline or cinematic perfection. It was soft, slow, tired from years of longing, full of the kind of ache that turns into peace. And when it ended, their foreheads remained together, breaths mingling. "I don't need a headline," she whispered. "I don't need a future I can't hold," he answered. "Just this. Just now." And in that garden, beneath the moon and the rustling leaves, a man who had lost almost everything and a woman who had given everything finally found something neither expected at this stage in life: rest. Not just in each other's presence, but in the silence they no longer needed to fear. The next morning, the world would wake up to rumors and paparazzi photos of Keanu leaving her house at dawn. But none of that mattered. Because for once, the real story wasn't for them. It was for her. It was for him. It was for the children who had always known his name, even when he wasn't there. The moment the past walked in. It had been 3 months since that first televised moment where Keanu Reeves spoke his truth, and while the media had tried every angle to spin it into gossip, no one could truly touch what was unfolding in private. Keanu and Sandra had quietly slipped into a rhythm, one that wasn't flashy or performative, but steady and honest. It wasn't about being a power couple. It was about long walks with no cameras, about making pancakes with Layla on Sunday mornings, about Louis and Keanu silently building a treehouse together for weeks without speaking more than necessary, but speaking enough. It was about healing in ordinary spaces that had once felt foreign to them both. For the first time in years, they didn't feel like stars orbiting a lonely system. They felt human, held, home. But love, no matter how deep, eventually must face the ghosts it thought it buried. It happened on a crisp Saturday evening. Sandra had invited a few close friends over for a quiet dinner, just people she trusted, people who knew how to laugh without asking for selfies. The house was filled with warm jazz, the soft clink of glasses, and the scent of rosemary chicken roasting in the oven. Keanu was in the backyard helping Louis set up the lights along the treehouse path. The boy had asked him earlier, "Do you think you'll be here for my birthday?" And Keanu had looked him in the eyes and said, "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Louis hadn't smiled, he just nodded. But Keanu knew that nod carried more weight than any "I love you" ever could. Inside, Sandra was setting the table when the doorbell rang. She opened it with the ease of someone expecting a friend. But the smile vanished the moment she saw who stood there. It was Jesse, her ex-husband. Not the man from recent years who had faded quietly from public life, but the man who had once broken more than just promises. He had shattered trust, walked out when she needed strength, and disappeared in the one chapter of her life when love had turned to shadow. And now, without a warning, here he was, standing on her doorstep like time had no memory. Sandra's voice was calm but cold. "What are you doing here?" Jesse looked down, then up again. "I was in town, I heard. I just wanted to say something, in person." "This isn't the time," she said firmly. But behind her, Layla peeked out. "Mom, who's at the door?" Sandra turned slightly. "Go inside, baby." Before she could shut the door, Jesse spoke again. "I heard about Keanu, the interview, the pictures, all of it." She held her ground, and I just needed to say I'm sorry. It wasn't the apology that surprised her, it was the timing. Years ago, those 2 words could have changed everything. But now, they felt like pebbles tossed into an ocean she had already crossed. Sandra didn't reply. Keanu came around the corner then, wiping his hands with a towel, not realizing what he was walking into. He froze. Their eyes met. It wasn't a standoff, it wasn't jealousy, it was recognition. 2 men who had known the same woman, but held her very differently. Jesse looked between them, then stepped back. "I won't stay," he said. "I just wanted you to hear it once. I was wrong to leave. I didn't understand what I had, and I hope he does." He turned to walk away, but not before glancing at Keanu one last time. "Take care of them." Keanu nodded. "I already do." The door closed. Silence lingered. Keanu looked at Sandra. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. "I think I am." They didn't speak of it again that night, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't define anything. Sandra knew that the past always leaves echoes, but the present decides whether we keep listening. And Keanu, he didn't feel threatened by her past. He had his own. They both did. What mattered was who showed up now, who stayed. Later that night, as the guests said their goodbyes and the kids went to bed, Sandra and Keanu sat in the dimly lit kitchen, sipping tea in silence. She finally broke it. "You weren't even rattled." He gave a soft smile, "Because I know what's real." She looked at him, really looked, and felt something deeper than relief. Security. For years she had craved it, not in money, Not in fame, but in someone who didn't flinch when life brought its old bruises to the surface. "You're not afraid of the mess," she whispered. "I've lived in it," he replied, "but with you it feels like home." That night she lay beside him not as a woman running from her past, but as one who had faced it and won. And Keanu didn't hold her like someone trying to fix her. He held her like someone who knew the cracks and loved her because of them, not in spite of them. And outside, the treehouse lights glowed gently, like a promise waiting in the branches. They didn't talk about tomorrow. They didn't need to. Because for the first time in forever, they were both exactly where they were meant to be. Together. The quietest vows are sometimes the loudest. The sun rose gently over the canyon, filtering through the glass walls of the quiet home where, for the first time in many years, peace didn't feel borrowed or fragile, it felt earned. The past had finally stopped knocking. The media frenzy had moved on to newer stories, and the rumors, once relentless, now felt like faded echoes from another life. In this silence, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock found what neither of them had chased, but both had needed: stillness. A life not defined by headlines, but by soft mornings. Not by declarations, but by gestures so consistent they felt like breathing. It had been nearly a year since Keanu stood on that television stage and broke open a silence that had lasted decades. One sentence, one truth, and now a whole world had bloomed quietly from that moment. The kind of life they once thought had passed them by, but fate, as it often does with the patient, had circled back. Their days were not cinematic, not in the way their movies once were, but they were full of beauty. Keanu had become a fixture in Louis and Layla's lives, not as a replacement, not as a new dad, but as a presence. A guide, a friend, a quiet protector. The treehouse had long since been completed, now covered in hand-painted signs and wind chimes made from old bike parts and bottle caps, Layla's idea. Every evening, Keanu would help Louis with homework while Sandra prepared dinner, her laugh echoing from the kitchen, her voice calling out, "Don't let him distract you with motorcycle stories again." He never did, except sometimes he did, and Louis would listen, not because Keanu was famous, but because he respected him, trusted him, the way a boy trusts a man who never makes promises he can't keep. But the truest transformation had happened between Keanu and Sandra, not in fireworks, but in the tiny, sacred choices made every day, waking up together and brushing their teeth in the same small mirror, taking late-night walks without security or fans, him holding her hand in the grocery store when she was overwhelmed, her sitting silently beside him on the anniversary of his daughter's death, not saying a word, just being there. He didn't cry, but she did, and that somehow healed them both. One evening they attended a charity event together, not as actors, not as stars, but as guests. It was the first time they had walked a red carpet side by side since the headlines began. When they arrived, the cameras flashed, questions flew. "Is it official? Are you two a couple now? Any wedding bells?" But they smiled, waved, and said nothing, because the truth didn't belong to the world, it belonged to them. But something happened that night that neither of them expected. A young girl, barely 10, approached them in the ballroom. She had lost her mother to cancer the year before and had come with her aunt. She looked at Sandra, then at Keanu, and said softly, "You both feel like the kind of people who don't leave." Sandra knelt down, tears pricking her eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart." The girl looked at Keanu. "You were in John Wick, right?" He smiled. "I was." She nodded, "But this version of you is better." That night back home, Sandra sat on the back porch while Keanu brewed them tea. The moon hung low, and the stars blinked like they had stayed up just to listen. He handed her a cup. "You know," he said softly, "I don't think I've ever felt this quiet in my head before." She smiled. "That's a good thing." "It's a miracle." And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he pulled a small wooden box from his pocket. Not a ring box, not something flashy or designed for attention. Just a hand-carved box, the kind you find in a market when you're not looking for anything. Inside it was a note, folded 3 times, with her name on it. She opened it, read it silently, then looked up. "You don't want to propose with a ring?" She teased gently, eyes glistening. He shook his head. "We've never done anything the usual way. I didn't want this to be a question. I wanted it to be a truth." She looked down at the note again. The words were simple. "I'm not asking you to marry me because we're expected to. I'm telling you that for the rest of my life, I want to keep choosing you. If you want the same, let's just start calling it forever." Her answer was quiet. She took his face in her hands. "Let's start now." And so they did. Not with vows recited under arches or 100 white roses, but in the most sacred chapel of all, a quiet Sunday morning where Sandra made breakfast while Keanu hummed a Johnny Cash tune, and Louis fixed the loose tile by the front steps while Layla danced barefoot across the yard. Later that day, they all went to the treehouse. Keanu had built a tiny bookshelf into it and filled it with journals and sketches. Louis added a sign, "Tree of Trust." Layla, of course, decorated it with glitter. As the sun set, Sandra looked at him, this man who had never needed to be loud to be strong, never needed to chase her to prove love. He had simply stayed, and in staying, he had taught her what real love felt like. Not loud, not perfect, but certain. And somewhere between the soft creak of the treehouse stairs and the wind rustling through the chimes, a vow hung in the air, unspoken, but stronger than any ceremony. That no matter where the world twisted, or what scripts they were handed, they would always find their way back. To the silence, to the truth, to each other,